Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we are going to travel back in time. We are going to leave behind the hum of central heating, the glow of our screens, and the steady, predictable rhythm of modern life. We are going to journey north, far north, to a world carved by fjords and shadowed by ancient forests, to a time when the very act of survival was an art form, and the turning of the seasons was not a date on a calendar, but a force of nature that dictated every heartbeat of a people's existence. Before we go any further, I always find it grounding to know where these stories are landing. It connects us all in this shared space, this quiet moment. So, if you feel moved to, please do leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from, and what time the clock reads where you are. I'm recording this as the night settles in here, the world outside growing still. Whether you are in a bustling city or a quiet countryside, I am honored to have you here. Now close your eyes for a moment if you are able. Imagine the air. It is not the air we breathe. It is cold and sharp, so cold it almost has a taste, salt and pine and the faint earthy scent of damp wool. This is the world of the Vikings, a world that stretches across the vast, sprawling canvas of Scandinavia, a land of deep, haunting beauty and punishing extremes. We often think of them as warriors, as raiders who descended from the sea with terrifying speed. And they were. But the story of the Viking people, the true story, is not written in the clash of swords but in the quiet, relentless struggle against the winter. The popular image is one of brutish men in horned helmets, a myth we need to gently set aside right now, living for violence. But this is a caricature. The Viking Age, a period that roughly spans the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, was primarily an age of farmers, fishers, traders, and extraordinarily skilled craftspeople. Theirs was a life governed by the sun, or more accurately, by its absence. The Norse calendar didn't divide the year into 4 seasons like ours. It acknowledged just 2, summer and winter. Summer was a brief, frantic explosion of light and growth, a time for planting, raiding, and trading, all carried out under a sun that barely dipped below the horizon. Winter, on the other hand, was a long, dark, and unforgiving siege. To understand how they survived, to truly feel the texture of their lives, we have to start with the very fabric of their homes. We have to step inside the longhouse. Let's walk through the doorway of one now, a low entrance that forces you to duck, a design that served to keep the precious heat inside and the biting wind out. These structures were the beating heart of the Viking world. Imagine a building so long and sweeping that it resembles a ship turned upside down on the land, its curved roof mimicking the keel of the great vessels that carried them across the open ocean. They could be truly vast, from 5 to 7 meters wide and stretching anywhere from 15 to an incredible 75 meters in length. In these communal halls, several families, a chieftain, his kin, their servants, and even the animals, would all live, eat, sleep, and work together under one roof. This was not a world of privacy. There were no individual rooms, no quiet corners to retreat to. The longhouse was a single, unified space, a microcosm of their society where life was lived communally. The very materials of the walls tell a story of adaptation. In the densely forested regions of southern Scandinavia, the walls might be built from towering vertical planks of oak or pine. But further north, and especially in the more barren landscapes of Iceland or Greenland, timber was a precious rarity. Here, the walls were constructed from the earth itself. Thick sods of turf were cut from the ground and stacked, like heavy green bricks, creating walls that were incredibly thick and provided superb insulation against the cold. A longhouse made of turf must have had an organic, living quality, seeming to grow from the landscape itself, its roof sprouting with grass where sheep might graze. The roof was a masterpiece of weight management, often supported by 2 rows of massive, ship-like timbers that ran the length of the interior, holding up the heavy weight of the turf or thatch above. And at the very center of this long, dark space, there was the heart and soul of the home, the hearth. This was not a contained fireplace like ours, but an open stone-lined pit running down the middle of the floor. Here, a fire was kept burning constantly, a fragile thread of warmth and light tethering the inhabitants to life itself. Because there were no chimneys, no windows, the smoke from the fire had no place to go but up. It would weave its way through the thatch of the roof, filling the interior with a thick, acrid haze that got into your lungs, clung to your clothes, and made your eyes sting. It was a perpetual living fog. For them, it was simply the smell of home, the smell of survival. But how did they keep warm? How did a single open fire heat a building the length of a modern city block? The design was ingenious. The curved shape of the roof was not just for show. It served as a natural funnel, channeling the rising heat back down along the walls to warm the entire room, creating a surprisingly even temperature for the inhabitants. Along the long walls were raised platforms, built from packed earth and lined with wooden planks. These served as benches during the day, places to sit and work, and by night they were transformed into beds. Families would sleep side by side, wrapped in furs and woolen blankets, their bodies sharing warmth, their dreams filled with the echo of the wind outside. To make this harsh environment even marginally comfortable, the Vikings filled their longhouses with small domestic luxuries. They would collect soft heather and dry it, using it to stuff bedding for a more comfortable sleep. Animal skins, bear, wolf, or seal, would be draped over the benches for warmth and comfort. We have evidence of wall hangings and even cushions, suggesting a desire for beauty and softness even in the most rugged of settings. Light, precious light, was provided by hanging lamps made of stone or pottery, fueled by animal fat or fish oil. Imagine that fragile, flickering glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. A single lamp, casting long, dancing shadows on the soot-blackened timbers of the roof. This was the stage upon which the drama of winter survival was played out. As the days grew shorter and the first frosts began to creep across the ground, a sense of urgency would grip every community. The light was dying, and with it, the land's ability to provide. The careful, strategic work of summer would culminate in a desperate scramble to prepare for the months of darkness ahead. The survival of everyone, from the greatest chieftain to the smallest child, depended entirely on the harvest that was brought in and how it was stored. Now let's talk about how they fed themselves. As autumns gripped tight, the farmers would make a grim but necessary calculation. The hay they had gathered in the precious weeks of July, August, and September would only sustain a fraction of their livestock through the long winter. The rest, they knew, must be slaughtered. This was not a wasteful act, but a sacred one. It was the final, ultimate gift from the animals they had raised. Nothing was wasted. This was the great autumn slaughter. The meat from cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, as well as the wild game hunted in the forests, had to be preserved to sustain the community through the dark months. They could not just stick it in a freezer. They had to use methods that were in harmony with the natural world around them. The most common method was drying. In the cold, dry northern air, meat would be hung from the rafters of the longhouse or in special outbuildings. The wind would slowly wick away the moisture, turning the flesh into a hard, nutrient-dense jerky that could last for years. In coastal communities, fish was the primary source of protein. They could choose from an astonishing 26 different types of fish, but the most important of all, the humble herring, was the backbone of their winter diet. The Arab traveler and writer Al-Tartushi, who visited the bustling Viking trading center of Hedeby in the 10th century, observed that fish was the most important source of nourishment for the inhabitants. They would salt the herring heavily, packing it into barrels with brine to create a preserved food that was both salty and satisfying. The cold, salty winds that howled along the coastlines also provided a perfect environment for preserving fish, slowly curing it as it hung on wooden racks. Meat was also salted, a process that was vital for preserving it through the winter. Salt itself was a hugely valuable commodity, often obtained through trade. They also smoked fish and meat, hanging it in the rafters above the central fire where the smoke from the constantly burning hearth would infuse it with a rich, woody flavor that also served as a preservative. But the Viking ingenuity didn't stop there. We know that they also preserved cooked meats in large vats, covered in sour whey. The lactic acid in the whey would act as a preservative, keeping the meat edible for months at a time. And showing a resourcefulness that we would call nose-to-tail cooking today, they made sausages from the offal and blood of the slaughtered animals, ensuring that not a single part of the animal was wasted. The longhouse would have been filled with the smell of these preserved foods, the saltiness of fish, the smoky, earthy aroma of cured meats. But what about the taste? What was it actually like to sit down to a meal in the Viking Age? The diet was stark but nourishing. The winters were a time of hearty, rib-sticking foods, designed to provide maximum energy to fight the cold. The main meal of the day was often a thick, warming stew or soup. This was not like our delicate consommes. It was a thick, primordial soup, a one-pot wonder where chunks of salted meat and dried fish would be slowly simmered with whatever root vegetables they had stored: turnips, cabbages, and onions. They ate twice a day. The first meal, known as the dagmal or day meal, was eaten about an hour after waking. It was often a simple affair, perhaps some leftover stew from the night before, served with a piece of hearty bread. The evening meal, the natmal, was the more substantial meal of the day, a time to gather around the fire and replenish the energy lost in the day's work. This meal would be the fish or meat stew, a soul-warming dish that must have been a comfort on the darkest of nights. They drank milk from their cows, goats, and sheep. To make it last, they churned it into butter and cheese, which were also heavily salted to prevent spoiling and provided a vital source of fat in a diet that was otherwise very lean. When you think about it, their diet was remarkably healthy, low in sugar, high in protein and fat, and built around what the land and sea could provide. Life inside the longhouse was a hive of constant activity. The idea that they just sat around and waited for winter to end is a myth. For the women and children especially, the winter was a time of intense labor. While the men might be mending tools, carving wood, or repairing the fishing nets, the women would be at the loom. Weaving cloth was one of the most important tasks in a Viking household. Every single piece of clothing they wore, from the simplest tunic to the finest cloak, had to be made by hand. This was a year-round job, but the winter months, when they were confined indoors, were a crucial time for it. The women would spin the wool from their sheep into yarn, using simple drop spindles that have remained unchanged for millennia. Then, they would weave this yarn into fabric on large, upright looms that dominated one end of the longhouse. The thwack of the loom was the heartbeat of the home, a sound as constant as the crackle of the fire. And what were these clothes like? Imagine dressing for a Viking winter. There were no Gore-Tex jackets, no fleece-lined boots. Instead, the Norse relied on layers, cleverly using the materials at their disposal. The base layer was typically linen, a fabric made from the flax plant. Linen is comfortable against the skin, and crucially, it wicks moisture away, a vital property when you are working and sweating even in the cold. Over this, both men and women wore a tunic, which would be made of thick wool. Men wore long trousers, either tight-fitting or baggy, and women would wear a distinctive apron-style dress, held up by two brooches at the shoulders, one on each side. These brooches were not just functional. They were often highly decorated pieces of jewelry, a signal of the wearer's status. In the depths of winter, they would add a long, warm overcoat known as a H-laff, made from thick wool, sheepskin, or sealskin. On their feet, they wore simple shoes made from a single piece of cowhide, sewn together with thread and stuffed with hay for insulation. For those living in the most extreme conditions, thick socks and overshoes made of leather or fur would be essential. To survive the brutal winters, the Vikings also learned to adapt their farming cycle to the rhythm of the seasons. As autumn drew to a close, the cattle would be brought in from the pastures. Unlike sheep and goats, which could endure the freezing temperatures, the cows were too valuable to risk losing to the frost. They would be housed in the far end of the longhouse or in a separate byre, often attached to the main dwelling. This must have added a new dimension to the atmosphere of the home. The warmth of the animals' bodies provided precious heat, but it also brought with it the smells of the barn, a thick, earthy odor of hay and manure that would mingle with the wood smoke and the scent of cooking food. This was the reality of their existence. There was no separation between the domestic and the agricultural. As the ice and snow began to melt, the first signs of spring were greeted with a jubilant celebration known as Sigablot. This was a time of sacrifice, a time to thank the gods, especially Odin, the god of victory and poetry, for surviving the winter, and to ask for their blessing on the upcoming raiding and trading season. It was a time of optimism, a collective sigh of relief as the world re-emerged from its icy shroud. The start of summer wasn't just about warmth. It was the signal for action. This was when the men would repair their longships and set sail. While the popular image is one of mindless violence, the reality of Viking expansion was far more complex. For many, the voyage was not just about raiding monasteries for silver and gold, though that certainly happened. It was also about finding new land to farm, escaping the overcrowded fjords of their homeland, and trading for goods and resources that they simply couldn't produce themselves. While the men were away, the women at home would take on the full responsibility of the farm. They would plant the crops, barley and oats were the staples, tend to the animals, and repair the buildings that had weathered the winter storms. With the return of the men and the arrival of summer, the longhouse would transform. The animals were moved outside and the air inside would clear a little. The long, slow work of the winter, the weaving, the repairs, the storytelling, would give way to the frantic, exhausting labor of the fields. But the memory of the winter was never far away. The knowledge that it would return as surely as the sun set shaped every decision they made. The summer months were spent in a fever of preparation, ensuring that when the darkness came again, they would be ready. It was a cycle of life and death, a dance with the elements that continued for generations. This was the world they knew. It was a harsh world, a world of seemingly impossible hardship, but it was also a world of profound meaning. Their lives were not just about survival, but about thriving within the bounds set for them by nature. They found beauty in the runestones they carved. They found comfort in the sagas they told by the fire, and they found strength in their community. Let us linger in this longhouse for a moment longer, as the fire crackles and pops, casting dancing shadows on the smoke-blackened rafters. We can hear the wind howling outside, a low, mournful sound that seems to come from the very heart of the winter itself. But inside, in this small pocket of warmth and light, there is a sense of peace. A child is falling asleep on a bed of furs, the grandmother is quietly spinning wool, and the family is gathered around the fire, the scent of a hearty stew filling the air. They are tired, but they are alive. They have survived another day. And as the fire dies down and the shadows grow longer, the old man begins to speak, his voice a low, rhythmic murmur, telling a story of gods and giants, of creation and destruction. a story of how the world began and how it would one day end. The words wash over them, a familiar comfort against the dark. The winter solstice approaches, the darkest day of the year, and for the Vikings this was not a time of despair but a time of hope. It was the festival of Yule, a celebration that predates our Christmas by centuries, a time of feasting and ritual. The Yule log was brought into the longhouse, a massive piece of timber that would burn for days on end, its fire a symbol of the returning sun. Feasts were held, oaths were sworn over the sacred boar, and sacrifices were made to Odin and the god of fertility, Freya. The idea was to give the sun strength, to help it return and bring with it life and light. Bring with it life and light. The festivities would last for days, a defiant blaze of warmth and community against the freezing darkness. They would feast on the meat from the autumn slaughter, drink ale and mead, and exchange gifts. It was a time to reaffirm bonds, to remind themselves that they were not alone in their struggle. The children would play games, the adults would share stories, and for a brief, shining moment, the hardship of their existence would be forgotten in the warmth of the fire and the joy of togetherness. But Yule would pass, as all things must, and the long, dark months would stretch on. The community would settle back into its quiet rhythm, the days marked not by the sun but by the tasks that needed to be done. And yet there was always a sense of anticipation, a quiet knowing that the world was slowly, imperceptibly beginning to turn. The days, though still brutally short, were growing ever so slightly longer. A change so subtle you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. But they were paying attention. They had to. Their understanding of the natural world was profound, born not from textbooks but from generations of living within it, observing its every mood and whisper. They knew the patterns of the stars, the behavior of the animals, the way the wind tasted before a storm. This was their calendar, their almanac, their guide to survival. The return of the sun was the most important event in their year, and they greeted it with a reverence that is hard for us to comprehend in our world of electric lights and central heating. The darkness was not just an absence of light. It was a presence, an active force that could kill. The return of the light was a rebirth, a promise that the world would continue. And as the light grew stronger, so too did the activity in the longhouse. The weaving would intensify. The women would be preparing the spring clothing, lighter tunics made of linen that would be more comfortable for the warmer weather. The men would begin to inspect their tools, sharpening their axes and scythes, repairing their plows. The first green shoots of new grass would be spotted near the door, and there would be a collective sense of relief. The worst was over. But let us not rush ahead. The transition from winter to spring was a slow, messy affair. The snow would melt, turning the ground into a quagmire of mud that made travel almost impossible. The paths would be treacherous, the rivers swollen with meltwater. This was a time of waiting, of patience. A time when the Vikings, trapped between the retreating winter and the reluctant arrival of spring, had to rely on their stores more than ever. The last of the preserved food would be eaten, and the hunger would be at its sharpest. It was a delicate balance, a final test of their resilience before the land could once again provide. Then finally, the moment would come. The ice on the fjords would begin to crack and groan, a sound like thunder rolling across the water, and with a great shuddering sigh, the winter grip would loosen. The ice would break apart, floating out to sea, and the water would be free once more. The smell of the earth, rich and fertile, would fill the air, and the Vikings, their hearts buoyed by the warmth of the returning sun, would prepare to leave their longhouses and return to the land. The fields that had lain fallow for months would be plowed. The oxen, having been sheltered all winter, would be brought out to pull the heavy wooden plows. The soil would be turned, revealing a dark, moist earth that was ripe for planting. This was backbreaking work, but it was a labor of love, a sign that life was returning. The women and children would follow behind the plow, carefully planting the seeds of barley and oats. These grains were the staff of life, the source of their daily bread. Alongside the grain, they would plant vegetables, cabbage, onions, peas, and beans, in small garden plots near the longhouse. This was a time of hope, a time of renewal. The Viking summer was a frantic, almost feverish period of activity. There was no time to waste. The sun was a gift that had to be used to its fullest. The men would fish, sailing out into the fjords to catch cod and herring. They would also hunt, tracking deer and elk in the forests, or venturing out onto the sea to hunt seals. The women would be busy too, caring for the newborn lambs and kids, gathering the first of the wild berries, and beginning the process of making cheese and butter from the fresh milk. The longhouse itself would undergo a transformation. The animals were moved outside, and the accumulated smoke and soot would be cleaned. The interior would be opened up, the door left wide to let in the fresh air. The smell of wood smoke and manure would be replaced by the scent of drying grass and blooming wildflowers. It was as if the house itself was breathing a sigh of relief. In this season of light, the longhouse became a place of preparation, a workshop for the busy months ahead. New weapons would be forged, the ships would be repaired and painted, and the great looming would continue. But now the cloth would be for trade, a valuable commodity to be exchanged for silver or other goods. And of course, this was the time for the raids. For many young Viking men, the summer was a chance to find adventure and fortune overseas. The longships, sleek and swift, would be launched from the beach and the crews would set sail. They would follow the coastal routes, their eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale signs of a wealthy settlement, a church with a silver cup, a market town with rich merchants. The raids were brutal, there is no denying that. They were a source of fear and terror for the people of Europe. But for the Vikings, they were a form of trade, a way of acquiring the resources they needed: silver, slaves, fine cloth, that they could not produce themselves. And the wealth they brought back would be shared with their community, distributed among the families who had stayed behind to tend the farms. But the raids were just one aspect of a vast and complex network of trade. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were merchants of the highest order. They established trade routes that stretched from the coast of North America, where they traded with the indigenous people, all the way to the great cities of the Middle East, where they sold furs, walrus ivory, and slaves in exchange for silver, silk, and spices. They were the great connectors of the early medieval world, their longships serving as the arteries of a massive trading network. The summer months were spent on these journeys, the ships laden with goods to be bartered in far-off markets. And when the men returned, they would bring with them stories of distant lands, tales of strange people and wondrous treasures. These stories would be shared around the fire, adding to the rich tapestry of their oral tradition. The longhouse, which had been a silent witness to the slow, grinding struggle of winter, would now be alive with laughter and the thrill of adventure. The children would listen, wide-eyed, dreaming of the day they too would sail away. This is how they lived, in a constant, rhythmic cycle of hardship and reward, of darkness and light, of fear and hope. The winter was a crucible, a time that tested their very souls. It stripped away the unnecessary, leaving only what was essential for survival. And it created a people who were fierce, resilient, and deeply connected to the world around them. They did not see themselves as separate from nature, but as a part of it. Their gods were forces of nature: Thor, the god of thunder and lightning; Njord, the god of the sea; Freya, the god of fertility and the harvest. They worshipped the sky, the sea, the earth, and they lived their lives in accordance with its rhythms. Let us pause here for a moment and try to truly understand the texture of a Viking winter, not just from the outside, but from the inside. Imagine the quiet. It is a deep, profound silence, broken only by the howling of the wind and the crackling of the fire. In this quiet, the mind turns inward. There is a meditative quality to the long winter nights. Without the constant distractions of our modern world, the Vikings developed a rich inner life. They were a deeply philosophical people, prone to introspection. The silence of the winter was a perfect canvas for their thoughts. They thought about the past, the deeds of their ancestors, the great heroes of their sagas. They thought about the future, the prospects of the next summer, the marriages of their children. And they thought about the great, unknowable mystery of death. Their world was stark, and they did not shy away from the darker aspects of existence. They believed in fate, in a preordained destiny that was woven by the Norns, three ancient beings who spun the thread of every person's life. There was a certain fatalism to their worldview, a quiet acceptance that some things were simply beyond their control. This was not a form of pessimism, but a form of strength. It allowed them to face the brutal reality of their lives without despair. You fought as hard as you could, you lived as well as you could, but in the end, what would be would be. This fatalism was woven into the very fabric of their society. They believed that a man was defined by his deeds, not by the circumstances of his birth. If you died well, bravely, with honor, you would be welcomed into Valhalla, the great hall of Odin, where you would feast and fight for all eternity. This belief gave them a remarkable courage, a willingness to face death without flinching. It was a powerful force that allowed them to survive in a world of almost unimaginable peril. But it would be a mistake to think of them as grim or joyless. On the contrary, they loved life. They loved feasts, they loved music, they loved games and competitions. The long winter nights were a time for celebration, for storytelling, for drinking. They brewed a potent ale from barley and they made mead, a sweet and intoxicating drink fermented from honey. These drinks were more than just beverages. They were social lubricants, aids to conversation and storytelling. A feast would be held to mark any important occasion, a birth, a wedding, a successful raid, or simply the end of the winter. At these feasts, the longhouse would be transformed. The benches would be rearranged, the finest tablecloths would be brought out, and the food would be abundant. There would be roasted meat, boiled fish, fresh bread, and bowls of creamy stew. And the drinking would commence. The host would pass a horn of ale or mead around the room, and each person would drink a toast. They would toast to Odin, the god of poetry and death. They would toast to Freya, the god of prosperity. And they would toast to their ancestors, the heroes of their clan. These were not just empty rituals. They were acts of communion, a way of binding the community together. The exchange of toasts was a way of affirming loyalty, of resolving conflicts, of forging alliances. It was a deeply social event that strengthened the bonds of kinship and friendship. The story, too, was a crucial element of the feast. The Vikings had a rich oral tradition, and the most skilled storytellers were revered members of the community. They could recite epic poems known as sagas that told of the adventures of heroes, the exploits of gods, and the history of their people. These sagas were not just entertainment. They were a repository of wisdom, a record of their culture. They taught moral lessons, they preserved their history, and they kept the memory of their ancestors alive. Listening to a saga was a way of connecting with the past, of understanding who they were and where they came from. The style of these stories was distinctive. It was terse, direct, and full of stark imagery. The language was poetic, rich with kennings, metaphorical phrases that added depth and beauty. A ship might be called a sea steed, a warrior a spear tiger, the sea a whale road. This was not just a decorative flourish. It was a way of seeing the world, a way of making the ordinary extraordinary. The sagas transported the listener to another world, a world of magic and monsters, of honor and betrayal. These winter nights were also a time for craftsmanship. The longhouse was a workshop where a wide variety of skills were practiced. The men would carve intricate designs into wood and bone, creating beautiful objects, drinking cups, gaming pieces, combs, and even toys for the children. They would also work with metal, forging new tools or repairing old ones. The women would continue their weaving, but they would also embroider, creating beautiful patterns on the fabric. They would also make shoes, sewing the leather with strong thread made from animal sinew. This was a time of quiet productivity, a time when the practical skills of the community were honed and preserved. And always, there was the shadow of the supernatural. The Vikings believed that the world was inhabited by a host of spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. The winter was seen as a time when the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits was at its thinnest. The wild hunt, the terrifying ghostly procession of Odin and his warriors, was said to ride through the skis during the darkest nights. To be caught outside during the wild hunt was to risk being swept away into the spirit world. The darkness was filled with unseen dangers, with trolls and other malevolent beings. The longhouse was not just a shelter from the elements, it was a refuge from these spiritual threats. The fire was a protection, a barrier against the darkness. The sound of the family talking, working, and living was a shield, a way of pushing back the loneliness and fear of the frozen night. Despite these fears, life continued. Children were born, grew up, and played in the dark of the longhouse. The older generation would share their wisdom, passing on the skills that had kept their people alive for generations. Young men would listen to the stories of the heroes and dream of their own adventures. Young women would learn the secrets of the household, how to prepare food, how to weave cloth, how to heal the sick. The longhouse was a school, a place of learning where the knowledge of the community was transmitted from one generation to the next. And as the nights grew shorter and the dawn came earlier, the people would feel a stirring of hope. The end of winter was in sight. The cattle would begin to calve, the sheep to lamb. The first shoots of green would appear in the fields. The sound of birdsong would return, a chorus of life after the silence of the winter. The longhouse, which had been so sealed and enclosed, would begin to open up. The doors would be left ajar, the smoke would clear, and the people would start to spend more time outside. The transition back to the world of light was a gradual one, a slow awakening. The people would shake off the lethargy of the winter months. Their bodies, which had been conserving energy, would begin to stir. The first warm days were a shock to the system, a reminder of the pleasure of the sun on the skin. They would shed their heavy winter clothes, their thick woolen tunics, and don their lighter linen garments. The difference in sensation must have been profound, a liberation from the heavy weight of their winter layers. This was the moment for the great spring cleaning. The longhouse, which had been accumulating the grime of the winter, would be thoroughly scoured. The old floor coverings would be replaced, the walls would be scrubbed, and the roof would be checked for leaks. The soot and grime were washed away, a ritual purification that marked the beginning of the new season. The longhouse was made new again, ready for the life that was about to return. It was a time of rebirth, not just for the world outside, but for the world inside. The return of the light brought with it a sense of renewal. The people of the longhouse, the survivors of the winter, would look around at each other and feel a deep sense of gratitude. They had made it. The darkness had been vanquished and the light had returned. They would celebrate this victory with a simple meal, giving thanks to the gods for their mercy. And then they would turn their attention to the work that lay ahead. The soil was ready, the seed was prepared, and the sea was once again navigable. World would be reborn, and the cycle would begin again as it always had. But the memory of the winter, the memory of the darkness and the cold would never truly leave them. It was etched into their bones, into their psyche. It made them who they were. It gave them a toughness that was admired and feared by their neighbors. It gave them a perspective on life that was both humble and fierce. They understood better than most the fragility of life, and they understood better than most the value of community. The Viking spirit was forged in the long winter nights. It was a spirit of endurance, of resilience, of quiet strength. It was a spirit that could weather any storm, that could face any hardship. It was a spirit that found joy in the simple things: the warmth of the fire, the taste of a hot meal, the comfort of a loved one's presence. It was a spirit that looked at the vast, cold, and indifferent universe and said, "I am here. I will survive." And so, as we sit here in our own comfortable worlds, warmed by our own central heating and illuminated by our own screens, let us remember the people who lived in the longhouses. Let us remember their courage, their ingenuity, and their profound connection to the world around them. Theirs was a harder life than we can possibly imagine, but it was a life filled with meaning. They faced the darkness and they endured it. And in doing so, they created a legacy that has lasted for 1,000 years. Now the world outside the longhouse is changing. The warmth of the sun is becoming more consistent. The days are getting longer. The soil is dry enough to work. The men are beginning to prepare the boats for the summer's voyages. The women are planning the planting. The children are starting to explore the world beyond the door, chasing the first butterflies of the season. The longhouse feels emptier now that the animals are outside, and the air inside is less smoky, but it's still the central hub of life. The sounds of the village are shifting. The hammering of the blacksmith rings out, a rhythmic counterpoint to the birdsong. The sound of the loom is quieter now as the women spend more time in the fields. The men are busy with the plows and the seeds. It is a time of hectic activity, a time of building for the future. The winter stores are running low, but the land is beginning to provide again. There is fresh milk, fresh greens, and the first eggs. The food, after months of smoked fish and salted meat, is beginning to taste fresh again. The meals are lighter, more varied, and more satisfying. The social structure of the village is also visible in the daily activities. The chieftain, or jarl, would oversee the work, organizing the planting and the distribution of resources. His power was based not on law, but on his ability to provide for his community. A good chieftain was generous, wise, and strong. He led by example, working alongside his men in the fields and fighting alongside them in battle. The bond between a chieftain and his followers was sacred. A follower known as a hearth companion or housecarl owed his chieftain loyalty and military service. In return, the chieftain provided his followers with protection, food, and gifts. This was a relationship of mutual obligation, the bedrock of their society. The free men, known as bondsmen, were the farmers and craftsmen who owned their own land. They had a voice in the things, the local assemblies where disputes were settled and laws were made. These things were a vital part of their society, a form of democratic governance that was remarkably advanced for its time. It was at the thing that a man's standing was measured, not by his birth, but by his reputation and his deeds. A man with a good reputation, a man who was honest and brave and generous, would be respected. A man who was dishonest or cowardly would be shunned. Reputation was everything. It was the currency of their world. The work of the women was equally important. They were the managers of the household, the weavers of cloth, the keepers of the keys. They had a great deal of authority within the domestic sphere. A woman could own property, she could divorce her husband, and in some cases she could even participate in trade. The Viking woman was not the subjugated figure of later medieval Europe. She was a partner, a vital contributor to the survival of her family. She was strong, she was capable, and she was respected. The children, too, had their roles. From a young age, they would be taught the skills they would need as adults. The boys would learn to handle a weapon, to fish, to sail, and to farm. The girls would learn to spin, to weave, to cook, and to run a household. They were taught not in schools but through a combination of observation and participation. They were an integral part of the community, their lives seamlessly woven into the fabric of the day's work. The learning was practical, hands-on. A young boy would be given a small axe and taught how to sharpen it. A young girl would be given a distaff and taught how to spin wool. This was how the traditions of the community were maintained. As the summer progresses, the pace of life in the longhouse settles into a new rhythm. The frantic, desperate days of early spring give way to the steady, hard work of summer. The crops are growing, the animals are fattening, and the village is prosperous. This is the time when the men of the community are most likely to be away on their raiding or trading expeditions. The women are left in charge, and they often have to defend the village against other raiders. The sagas tell of fierce women, known as shield maidens, who fought alongside the men. While this might be something of an exaggeration, it is clear that Viking women were expected to be tough and resourceful. They were the pillars of the community, holding everything together while the men were away. The knowledge of the natural world was not just a matter of survival, it was a matter of pride. A man who knew the weather, who could read the sea, who could navigate by the stars, was a man of great value. The Vikings were master navigators. They did not have compasses, but they had an intimate knowledge of the heavens and the sea. They knew how to navigate by the sun and the stars. They knew how to read the color of the water and the behavior of the birds to find land. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. It was a sacred tradition, the key to their dominance of the seas. Their ships, the longships, were the marvel of their age. They were fast, they were shallow-drafted, and they were versatile. They could sail across the open ocean, and then with their shallow hulls they could sail up rivers, enabling them to strike deep into the heart of enemy territory. The sight of a Viking longship with its fearsome dragon-headed prow was a terrifying one. These ships were not just tools of war. They were the symbols of their culture, the embodiment of their spirit of adventure. They were the vehicles of their history, carrying them to new worlds and bringing them home again. The longship was the thread that connected the scattered Viking communities, the link between the lonely farmsteads of Greenland and the glittering palaces of Constantinople. To build a longship was a feat of incredible craftsmanship, a testament to their skill and knowledge. Every plank, every rivet, every sail was made with care, a tribute to the sea that gave them life. The summer was a time for these voyages. For many families, the summer was also a time of reunion. The men would return from their raids or trading expeditions, their ships laden with treasures. There would be celebration, feasts, and stories. The longhouse would once again be full of men, their voices loud and their presence filling the space. There would be a sharing of the spoils, a distribution of wealth. The chieftain would give gifts to his followers, demonstrating his generosity and his worth. The women would be adorned with the finest jewelry, their status elevated by the success of their men. The community would be united, their bonds strengthened by the shared experience of adventure and risk. And then all too quickly the cycle would turn again. The days would begin to shorten. The nights would grow cooler. The first signs of autumn would appear. The Vikings, with their profound understanding of nature, would have been acutely aware of the changing seasons. They would see the yellowing of the leaves, the gathering of the birds for migration, the frost on the morning grass. And they would prepare. The great autumn slaughter would begin again. The animals that could not be kept through the winter would be killed. Their meat would be salted, smoked, and dried. Their hides would be turned into leather, their bones into tools. The sense of urgency that had gripped them in the spring would return, but now it was a different urgency. It was not the frantic rush of growth, but the methodical, careful work of consolidation. They had to gather everything they had produced, everything they had grown, everything they had earned, and they had to secure it against the coming siege. The fields would be harvested. The barley and oats would be cut with sickles, tied into sheaves and brought back to the farm. The grain would be threshed, separated from the chaff, and then stored in large wooden bins or in pits dug into the ground, lined with stone and sealed with clay to keep out the damp. The root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and onions would be pulled from the ground and stored in the cool, dark cellars beneath the longhouse. These cellars were carefully constructed to maintain a constant, cool temperature. They were the key to survival. A mistake in storage, a damp spot that allowed rot to set in, could doom a family to starvation. The women would have watched over the stores with a careful eye, checking them regularly, making sure that nothing had spoiled. The hay would be gathered and stacked. The haystacks were not just piles of grass. They were carefully constructed, thatched, and weighted down to prevent them from being blown away by the autumn storms. The quality of the hay, the care with which it was harvested and stored, would determine how many of the animals could survive the winter. The Vikings understood the value of their livestock, the preciousness of their lives. They would do everything they could to protect them. The animals were not just a source of food. They were a measure of wealth and status. A man with a large herd of cattle was a wealthy man. A man with a few scrawny sheep was a poor man. The animals were the foundation of their entire economic system. The fishing would also intensify. The men would spend long hours on the water, hauling in nets full of herring and cod. The fish would be gutted and cleaned on the shore, then salted and packed into barrels. The smokehouses would be busy, the smoke from the burning wood and fish bones filling the air with a pungent, savory smell. This was a time of abundance, a time when the land and sea offered their last gifts before the long winter silence. The people would eat well, their bodies storing up fat for the lean months ahead. The food would be richer, the meals more frequent. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a sense that they were racing against the clock. The work was not just physical, it was also social. The whole community would come together to help with the harvest. The bonds of kinship and friendship would be strengthened by the shared labor. There would be singing and storytelling to break the monotony of the work. Children would be kept busy, carrying water to the workers, chasing away the birds, gathering the stray ears of grain. The harvest was a time of celebration, a time when the community rejoiced in their collective success. The success of the harvest was a sign of the gods' favor. If the grain was abundant, the animals fat, and the fish plentiful, it meant that the gods were smiling on them. It was a time for feasts and sacrifices. And then the weather would begin to turn. The first frost would silver the fields in the morning. The wind would take on a new edge, a sharpness that cut through the woolen tunics. The sea would become rough and gray, the waves whipped into a fury by the autumn gales. The men would bring the boats up onto the shore, pulling them as far up the beach as they could, then covering them with tarps and weighted them down with stones to protect them from the winter storms. The voyages were over for the year. The world was closing in. The longhouse would be made ready. The roof would be checked for leaks, the walls reinforced against the wind. The floor would be covered with fresh straw, a soft and warm layer that would help to insulate the interior. The sleeping benches would be prepared, layered with furs and blankets. The fire in the central hearth would be built up, the flames burning bright. The animals would be brought back inside, their familiar smells and sounds filling the space. The longhouse would become the whole world again, a self-contained universe where the family would live, work, and survive. Sense of confinement would return. The days would grow shorter, the nights longer. The darkness would creep in, slowly at first, then more quickly until it seemed as if the sun barely rose at all. The people would become more introspective, their thoughts turning inward. The long winter nights were a time for reflection, a time to ponder the great mysteries of life. They would sit by the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, and they would talk. They would talk about the past, about the heroes of their clan. They would talk about the present, about the problems of the community. And they would talk about the future, about the plans for the next summer. This was the time for the things, the assemblies where the free men would gather to make decisions. The laws of the Vikings were not written down. They were memorized and recited by the law speaker, a figure of immense authority and respect. The laws governed every aspect of their lives, from marriage to inheritance to the resolution of disputes. The thing was a forum where these laws were applied. It was a place of debate and negotiation, a place where justice was served. The thing was the heart of their legal system, a testament to their belief in the rule of law. It was a place where even the powerful could be held accountable. The laws of the Vikings were pragmatic and often harsh. They were designed to maintain order in a society where the strong could easily oppress the weak. They valued honor above all else, and they had strict rules about insults and slander. An insult, whether it was a slur on a man's honor or a challenge to his courage, could be a matter of life or death. The law provided a way for such disputes to be resolved without violence, but it also recognized the importance of personal honor. A man who was unwilling to defend his honor was considered a coward, and a coward was not respected. The concept of honor was not just a personal matter, it was a family matter. An insult to one member of a family was an insult to the entire family. The family was the basic unit of their society, and they were fiercely loyal to their kin. This loyalty was the source of their strength, but it was also the source of their conflicts. A feud between families could last for generations, a cycle of violence and revenge that was almost impossible to break. The law provided a way to end these feuds through the payment of compensation. The compensation, known as wergild, was a sum of money that was paid to the family of the victim. The amount of wergild depended on the status of the victim. The price of a nobleman's life was far higher than the price of a slave's. This was a system of justice that was based on a hierarchy of value, a reflection of the social structure of their world. The winter nights were also a time for learning the law. The young men would listen as the older men recited the laws, memorizing the complex rules and precedents. This was their education, their preparation for adulthood. A man who knew the law was a man who could protect himself and his family. He could stand up for his rights, he could defend his honor, and he could negotiate a fair settlement in a dispute. The law was a source of power, and the knowledge of the law was a source of respect. And as the winter wore on, the people would look for signs of hope. The most important sign was the return of the sun. They would watch the horizon, waiting for the moment when the sun would begin its slow, steady climb back to its summer peak. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, was a time of both dread and anticipation. It was the darkest moment, the deepest point of the winter. But it was also the turning point, the moment when the darkness began to recede. They would hold celebrations to mark this moment, to encourage the sun to return. The Yule festival was the most important of these celebrations. It was a time for feasting, for giving gifts, for reaffirming the bonds of the community. They would burn a massive Yule log, a piece of timber that would burn for days, its fire a symbol of the returning warmth and light. The feasts would last for days, the people eating and drinking, singing and dancing, their spirits lifted by the hope of the coming spring. The Yule feast was also a time for prophecy. They would perform rituals to divine the future, to learn what the coming year would bring. They would cast lots, they would read the entrails of animals, they would look for signs in the natural world. The future was a subject of great concern. They lived in an uncertain world, a world where a bad harvest, a harsh winter, or an unexpected illness could destroy a family. They wanted to know what was coming. They wanted to be prepared. The stories told around the fire during these long winter nights were not just entertainment. They were a vital part of their spiritual and cultural life. The sagas, the poems, the tales of the gods, these were the texts of their religion. They explained the world, they provided moral guidance, and they connected them to their ancestors. The stories were passed down from generation to generation, changing slightly with each telling, but always retaining the core of the original tale. They were a living tradition, a continuous thread that bound the past and the present together. The gods of the Vikings were not distant, abstract beings. They were powerful, flawed, and deeply human. They were a part of the world involved in the lives of the people. They could be vengeful and cruel, but they could also be generous and kind. The Vikings prayed to them for good harvests, for safe voyages, for victory in battle. They offered them sacrifices, often of animals, sometimes of humans in the most desperate times. The sacrifice was a way of giving back to the gods, a way of showing their gratitude and their devotion. The gods, in return, would protect them and bless them with good fortune. The idea of fate, of a preordained destiny, was a central part of their belief system. They believed that every person had a destiny, a fate that was woven by the Norns, the three goddesses of fate. The Norns were not gods who could be swayed by prayer or sacrifice. They were forces of nature, beyond human control. This belief in fate gave the Vikings a certain stoicism. They did not see the point in worrying about the future. What would be, would be. Their job was to live well, to be brave, and to die with honor. This was not a philosophy of resignation. It was a philosophy of courage. The winter was also a time of sickness. The crowded conditions of the longhouse, the lack of fresh air, the dampness, and the cold all contributed to the spread of disease. The people would get sick and some would not survive. The herbal remedies of the time prepared by the women were the only form of medicine. They used plants and herbs to treat a wide range of ailments. They used willow bark for pain, which contains a natural form of aspirin. They used garlic and onion for infections. They used mugwort and betony for stomach complaints. The women who practiced this herbal medicine were respected members of the community. Their knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter, a vital part of the household tradition. Death was a constant presence in their lives. It was not something that was hidden away, it was a part of their daily existence. They understood the fragility of life, the shortness of their time on earth. When someone died, there would be a funeral. The body would be washed and dressed in the finest clothes. The funeral would be a ceremony, a celebration of the person's life. The family would gather, and there would be speeches and songs. The body would be buried or cremated, depending on the local tradition. A grave mound would be raised over the burial site, a visible memorial to the person who had lived and died. The grave goods would be buried with the deceased, items that they would need in the afterlife. A warrior would be buried with his sword, his shield, and his horse. A woman would be buried with her jewelry, her weaving tools, and her household goods. They believed that the afterlife was a continuation of this life, and they wanted to be prepared. The long winter nights were a time of mortality. The darkness was a reminder of the end, of the final darkness that awaited them all. But this awareness of death did not make them gloomy. On the contrary, it made them appreciate life more. They lived with a passion, a fierce joy in the simple pleasures of existence. The warmth of the fire, the taste of a good meal, the comfort of a loved one. These were things that were not taken for granted. They were cherished, celebrated, and remembered. The landscape around them was not just a backdrop. It was an active participant in their lives. The mountains, the fjords, the forests, these were not just places. They were beings, forces of nature that demanded respect. They saw the world as a living thing, a place filled with spirits and meaning. The wind that howled around the longhouse was not just air. It was the breath of the world. The thunder that rolled across the sky was the voice of Thor. The rain that fell was a gift from the gods. They were deeply connected to the land, their lives intertwined with its rhythms. The snow, which could be a deadly enemy, also had a kind of beauty. It muffled the world, creating a sense of deep, profound quiet. The light reflected off the snow was a strange, ethereal glow that seemed to come from the earth itself. The winter landscape was stark and beautiful, a world of white and gray and black. The long shadows, the deep blue of the twilight, the sparkle of frost on the trees, these were the sights that filled their days. They were a people who lived in a world of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary hardship. And they would endure. They would face the winter again and again. The cycle would continue. The children would grow up, they would have their own children, and they would pass on the lessons they had learned. The great oak of their culture would grow slowly, its roots deepening with each generation. The stories would be told, the songs would be sung, and the memory of their ancestors would live on. The longhouse was more than just a shelter. It was a vessel that carried their history, their culture, and their hopes for the future. As we sit here in our own warm rooms listening to this story, we can feel the distance between our world and theirs. We live in a world of comfort and convenience. We do not worry about the winter. We do not worry about starvation. We do not worry about the raiders from the sea. But we can still learn from them. We can learn about resilience, about community, about the importance of living in harmony with the world around us. Their story is a reminder that we are not the first people to face hardship, and we will not be the last. But we can choose how we face it. We can face it with fear and despair, or we can face it with courage and hope. The Vikings, in their longhouses, chose courage and hope, and that is why we are still talking about them today. The later winter months would often bring the worst of the storms. The snow would pile up against the longhouse, burying the lower parts of the walls. The door would sometimes be blocked, and they would have to dig themselves out. The cold would become more intense, a biting, penetrating cold that seemed to get into the very bones. The fire would need to be fed constantly, and they would burn through their store of wood at an alarming rate. The men would have to go out into the forest, even in the worst weather, to gather firewood. It was a dangerous task. The snow could be deep, the trails could be hidden, and a man could easily become lost and freeze to death. And yet they did it. They did it because they had no choice. They did it because the alternative was death. The daily routine of the winter was a testament to their indomitable will. The women would get up before dawn to start the fire. The men would go out to tend to the animals. The children would help with the chores. The work was unending, but it was a labor that sustained them. It gave their lives a purpose. They were not just surviving, they were living. The technology of their world was simple but effective. Their tools were made of iron, wood, and bone. Their clothes were made of wool, linen, and leather. Their homes were made of wood, stone, and turf. They did not have the conveniences of our modern world, but they had the skills to create everything they needed. They were self-sufficient, a people who could live off the land. This was a source of immense pride. They did not depend on anyone else for their survival. They were masters of their own destiny. And as the winter began to loosen its grip, the people would feel a profound sense of relief. The first signs of spring would bring with them a new hope. The smell of the earth, the return of the birds, the melting of the snow, these were the signs that they had survived again. The longhouse, which had been their prison and their refuge, would begin to empty. The animals would be led outside. The door would be left open, and the people would step out into the light. There was a ceremony to mark this moment. They would take a torch from the fire and carry it outside, symbolically bringing the light and warmth of the home into the new world. They would offer a sacrifice to the gods, thanking them for their protection. They would share a meal, the first meal eaten outside the longhouse. It was a gesture of defiance, a statement that they were not afraid of the cold. They had faced the winter and they had won. The months of summer would then begin again. The people would work, they would travel, they would trade, they would love, and they would fight. The world would be alive with activity. The longhouse would be a quieter place, a place of preparation and planning. The women would be busy with the weaving, the men with the building of ships. The children would be learning their trades, and the old people would sit in the sun, watching the world go by. The summer was a time for building. They would build new ships, new houses, new community structures. The constant cycle of building and repairing was a fundamental part of their existence. The longhouse itself, which had weathered the winter, would be repaired. The walls would be patched, the roof would be rethatched, and the interior would be renovated. The longhouse was not just a building. It was a living thing, a member of the community. It needed to be cared for, just like the animals and the people. The social order was reinforced during the summer gatherings. There would be games, contests of strength and skill. The young men would compete in running, swimming, wrestling, and throwing. They would show off their skills in archery and swordplay. These competitions were not just entertainment. They were a way of establishing a man's status in the community. The man who was the strongest, the fastest, and the most skilled was the man who would be respected. He would be the man who could protect the community. He would be the man who could win the favor of the gods. The poetry, too, was a form of competition. The best poets, the skalds, were honored guests at any gathering. They would compose and recite poems in praise of their patrons, their deeds, and their ancestors. The poem was a gift, a way of immortalizing a person's name. The skill of the poet was a sign of his intelligence and his education. It was a way of showing that he was a man of culture, a man of refinement. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were artists. They created beautiful objects, they told beautiful stories, and they composed beautiful poems. The summer was a time of relative peace. The harshness of the winter was a distant memory. The people would work hard, but they would also find time for pleasure. They would go to gatherings, they would visit friends and family, and they would celebrate the festivals. The world was a place of joy and abundance. The long, bright days were a gift, a time to be savored. But the Vikings knew better than most that summer could not last. The seasons would turn and the winter would return. The knowledge of this was always present, a shadow in the back of their minds. It gave their summer activities a sense of urgency. They were not just working for today, they were working for the winter. They were storing up the harvest, not just for the immediate future, but for the months of darkness. They were building, not just for themselves, but for their children and their grandchildren. The cycle of life was unending. The people were born, they lived, they died. The winter came and the winter went. The longhouse was the constant, the one thing that remained the same. It was the home of their ancestors, and it would be the home of their descendants. It was the symbol of their continuity, the proof that they belonged to the land. And as the summer drew to a close, the people would begin to feel the change in the air. The nights would grow longer. The leaves would begin to turn. The first signs of autumn would appear. They would start to pack away their summer clothes and prepare for the winter. The men would bring the boats back to shore. The women would begin to process the last of the summer's harvest. The longhouse would begin to fill up again, the animals being brought in from the fields. The smell of the fields, the scent of dry grass and wildflowers, would be replaced by the earthier smell of the animals. The world was closing in again. The preparations for the winter were not just a practical matter. They were a ritual, a way of preparing the mind and the soul for the darkness. They would gather together as a community, sharing the work and the worry. They would strengthen the bonds of kinship and friendship. They would offer sacrifices to the gods, asking for their protection. They would build a sense of solidarity, a sense that they were all in this together. And then one day the first snow would fall. It would be a soft, gentle snow, a sign that the winter was coming. The people would look out at the falling snow and they would know that it was time. The world outside was going to sleep. The world inside, the world of the longhouse, was going to wake up. The cycle was beginning again. The stories of the winter were not just the stories of hardship. They were also the stories of hope. They were the stories of the sun returning, of the ice melting, of the world reborn. They were the stories of the heroes who had faced the darkness and had triumphed. These stories were not just entertainment. They were a source of strength. They reminded the people that they were not alone. They were part of a long line of survivors, a people who had faced the same hardships and had overcome them. The stories gave them the courage to face the winter, to face the darkness, and to face the uncertainty of the future. And so the longhouse would be filled with these stories. The fire would burn, the people would gather, the children would listen, the old man would speak, and the world outside, the world of wind and snow, would be forgotten for a little while. The longhouse was a sanctuary, a refuge from the storm. It was a place of warmth and light. It was a place of love and laughter. It was a place of life. As the winter nights stretched on, the people would become more and more accustomed to the darkness. Their eyes would adjust. They would see the world in a different way, in shades of gray and black. They would develop a sense of hearing that was far more acute than ours. They could hear the slightest sound, the whisper of a mouse in the straw, the crackle of the fire. Their world was small, but it was rich in sensory detail. The feeling of the rough wood under their hands, the taste of the salted fish on their tongues, the smell of the smoky air, these were the sensations that filled their lives. This was the nature of their reality. They were not just existing, they were experiencing the world with a depth and intensity that we can barely comprehend. This was the nature of their reality. They were not just existing, they were experiencing the world with a depth and intensity that we can barely comprehend. The feel of the cold air on their faces as they stepped outside for a moment to gather wood, the bite of the frost on their fingers, the way the stars seemed so close and so bright in the clear, frozen sky. They knew the world in a way that we have forgotten. They knew the land, the sea, the sky. They knew the animals, the plants, the cycles of the seasons. They were part of the world, not separate from it, and this gave them a strength, a resilience that we have lost. The longhouse, with its low ceiling and its smoky interior, was a world of shadows and half-light. The fire was the only source of illumination, and it created a landscape of light and dark. The faces of the people would be lit from below, their features softened by the flickering flames. The shadows would dance on the walls, playing tricks on the eyes. The children would imagine shapes in the darkness, monsters and heroes and strange creatures. The grandmothers would tell them stories of the things that lurked in the shadows, the trolls and the giants that lived in the mountains and the forests. The children would listen, both frightened and thrilled, their imaginations fired by the tales. The adults, too, were shaped by the darkness. They had to be brave, they had to be strong, they had to be able to face the unknown. The winter was a time of testing, a time when the weak were weeded out. Only the strong survived. And this strength was not just physical, it was mental and spiritual. They had to believe that they could survive. They had to have faith in themselves, in their family, in their community. The longhouse was the crucible in which this strength was forged. The communal life of the longhouse was not always harmonious. People lived in close quarters, and there were bound to be tensions and conflicts. The lack of privacy, the constant noise, the shared smells, these were the realities of their lives. There would have been arguments, disagreements, and petty jealousies, but the community was too closely knit to allow these conflicts to tear it apart. They had to get along. They had to work together. The survival of the group depended on their ability to cooperate. The longhouse was a pressure cooker, but it was a pressure cooker that produced a strong and resilient people. The social hierarchy was also a source of tension. The chieftain, the Jarl, was at the top of the social pyramid. He was the leader, the decision-maker, the provider. He had the most power and the most wealth. Below him were the free men, the bondsmen who owned their own land and had a voice in the thing. Below them were the freedmen, the former slaves who had earned their freedom. And at the bottom were the thralls, the slaves. These slaves were often prisoners of war or the children of slaves. They had no rights, no freedom. They were property, treated like animals. This was a brutal aspect of their society, a reminder that their world was not a world of equality and justice. It was a world of power and domination. The strong ruled the weak. The rich ruled the poor. This was the way of the world, and they accepted it. But even the thralls had a place in the longhouse. They were part of the community, albeit at the lowest rung of the ladder. They worked alongside the free men and women. They ate the same food, slept in the same space. They were part of the family, a subservient part. The distinction between a free man and a thrall was not always rigid. A thrall could earn his freedom through hard work and loyalty, and a free man could lose his freedom through debt or defeat. The social order was not fixed, it was fluid. This was a society in motion, a society where people could rise and fall. The women of the Longhouse held a unique position in this society. They were the managers of the household, the keepers of the keys. They were responsible for the food, the clothing, and the children. They had a great deal of power within the domestic sphere. They could influence their husbands. They could advise their sons. They were the spiritual leaders of the home, the ones who performed the rituals and offered the sacrifices to the household gods. The goddesses, Freya and Frigg, were powerful figures in their religion. And the women, the priestesses of the home, were seen as reflections of these divine beings. The sagas tell of women who were as brave and as strong as any man. They could fight, they could lead, they could make decisions. This is not to say that they were treated as equals. They were not. They were subservient to their fathers and their husbands. They did not have a voice in the thing, but within the confines of the Longhouse, they were the queens of their domain. They were the guardians of the home, the protectors of the family. Their role was essential, and they were respected for it. The bonds of marriage were not just romantic. They were practical. Marriage was a contract between two families, a way of forming alliances and consolidating wealth. The wedding was a celebration, a feast that could last for days. The bride would be given gifts, her family paid a price for the marriage. The new couple would be expected to work together, to build a life together. The marriage was a partnership, a union of two people who were committed to the survival and prosperity of their family. And the children were the future. They were the continuation of the family line. They were taught the skills they would need as adults, the traditions they would need to uphold. A son was expected to follow in his father's footsteps. A daughter was expected to follow in her mother's. The children were a source of joy and pride, but they were also a source of anxiety. The parents would worry about them, about their future. They would sacrifice for them, they would protect them. The love of a parent for a child was a powerful force, a force that could move mountains. As the winter progressed, the people would fall into a routine. The days would be marked by the tasks that needed to be done. The nights would be marked by the stories and the songs. The weeks would blur into each other, the dark days blending together. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch out. The world outside was frozen still. The world inside was a world of constant activity, a world of constant noise. But there was a rhythm to it, a predictability. The fire would be lit, the animals would be fed, the food would be cooked. The same tasks day after day. This monotony was both a comfort and a burden. It was a comfort because it was familiar, a burden because it was unending. The winter was a time of introspection. The silence of the world outside, the darkness of the long nights, these encouraged a turning inward. The people would think about their lives, their choices, their actions. They would think about their relationship with the gods. They would think about their deaths. This was not a morbid obsession, it was a practical reality. They lived in a world where death was a constant presence. They had to be prepared for it. They had to be ready to face the gods. The religion of the Vikings was a complex and often contradictory system of belief. They believed in a pantheon of gods, each with their own personality and their own domain. They believed in the great overarching story of the cosmos, the creation of the world, the ongoing struggle between the gods and the giants, and the final apocalyptic battle of Ragnarok. This was a world of cycles, of endless conflict. The world would be destroyed and then reborn. The stories of the gods were stories of heroism and tragedy, of loss and victory. They were a reflection of their own lives. The story of Ragnarok was a particularly powerful one. It was the story of the end of the world, a time when the forces of chaos would be unleashed. The gods would fight and most of them would die. The world would be consumed by fire and water, and then from the ashes, a new world would be born. This story was a source of both fear and hope. It was a reminder that the world was not eternal, that everything comes to an end. But it was also a reminder that the end is not the end. There is always a rebirth. There is always a new beginning. This story gave them the courage to face the darkness. They knew that the winter would end. They knew that the sun would return. They knew that life would continue. The rituals of the winter were designed to help them through this dark period. They would make offerings to the gods, asking for their protection. They would perform ceremonies to mark the passage of time. They would gather together to share their fears and their hopes. The rituals were a way of binding the community together, of creating a sense of unity. They were a reminder that they were not alone in their struggle. They were part of a larger story, a story that had been going on for generations. The mead hall, the longhouse of the chieftain, was often the center of these rituals. It was the place where the community would gather for the great feasts. The mead hall was larger, more elaborate, more decorated than the ordinary longhouses. The walls were adorned with shields and tapestries. The benches were made of finely carved wood. The hearth was large enough to roast a whole ox. The mead hall was a symbol of the chieftain's power, a testament to his wealth and his generosity. It was a place of hospitality, a place where strangers were welcomed and friends were honored. The chieftain who was generous, who shared his wealth, was the chieftain who was respected. And it was in the mead hall that the skald would perform. The skald was the poet, the historian, the entertainer. He would recite the sagas, the stories of the heroes. He would compose poems in praise of the chieftain and his ancestors. He would entertain the crowd with his wit and his wisdom. The skald was a vital part of Viking society. He was the keeper of their culture, the preserver of their history. He was the voice of the past, the teller of the tales. The skald was a man of immense skill, a man of great learning. The poems of the skald were not just stories, they were a form of magic. The words, the rhythm, the rhyme, these could have a powerful effect on the listener. They could inspire courage, they could provoke laughter, they could bring tears. The skald could weave a spell with his words, a spell that could transport the listener to another world. The poetry of the Vikings was a powerful art form, a way of shaping the world with language. The Norse myths themselves were a form of poetry. The stories of the gods were told in a rich, complex, and elusive style. They were full of kennings, the metaphorical phrases that gave the language its beauty and its depth. The myths were not just stories, they were the foundation of their religion. They explained the world, they provided moral guidance, and they connected the people to the divine. The myths were the soul of their culture. And as the winter continued, the people would tell and retell these myths. The stories would be passed down from generation to generation. The children would hear them and they would learn them. They would learn the names of the gods, the deeds of the heroes, the history of their people. They would learn the language of their ancestors, the language of the poems and the myths. The Longhouse was a school, and the stories were the curriculum. The winter was a time of education. The children were not sent away to school, they were taught by their parents and their grandparents. The education was practical, hands-on. They learned how to work, how to farm, how to fish, how to build. They learned how to tell stories, how to compose poetry, how to sing the songs. They learned how to behave, how to treat their elders, how to respect the gods. The education of a Viking child was a comprehensive education, a preparation for life. The older generation were the teachers. The grandparents, the elders of the community, were the keepers of the knowledge. They had lived through many winters and they had learned the lessons that only experience could teach. They were the source of wisdom, the guides for the young. They would share their knowledge, not just by telling, but by doing. They would show the children how to do the work, how to perform the rituals, how to live the life. The respect for the elderly was a cornerstone of their society. The old people were not seen as a burden, they were seen as a resource. They were the memory of the community, the link to the past. They were the ones who knew the stories, who knew the songs, who knew the laws. They were the ones who had seen the world, who had learned from their mistakes. The young people would listen to them, learn from them, and honor them. The elderly were the living connection to their ancestors, the embodiment of their history. And as the winter nights grew longer, the people would spend more and more time in the Longhouse. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, a place of danger and death. The world inside was a world of warmth and light, a place of community and comfort. The people would huddle together, seeking warmth and protection. The animals would huddle together, their bodies pressed against each other. The Longhouse was a refuge, a sanctuary. It was the center of their world. The isolation of the winter was a powerful force. The farms were spread out, separated by miles of snow and ice. The villages were isolated, cut off from each other. The people had to rely on themselves, on their own skills and their own resources. This isolation fostered a fierce independence, a sense of self-reliance. It also fostered a deep sense of community, a sense of solidarity. They were all in the same boat. They were all facing the same challenges. They had to work together to survive. And work together they did. The work of the winter was shared. The men would do the heavy lifting, the women would do the household tasks. The children would help where they could. The work was not seen as a chore, it was seen as a necessity. It was the price they paid for their survival, and they were grateful for the work. It gave their lives meaning. It gave them a purpose. The winter was also a time for creative expression. The lack of light, the long hours of darkness, the confinement of the Longhouse, these could be depressing. The people had to find ways to entertain themselves, to lift their spirits. They would tell stories, sing songs, play games. They would carve wood, weave cloth, make jewelry. They would create beautiful objects, objects that would brighten their world. The winter was a time of artistic production, a time when the creativity of the people could flourish. The arts and crafts of the Vikings were of a high order. They were skilled metalworkers, making weapons and jewelry of extraordinary beauty. They were skilled woodcarvers, creating intricate designs on their ships and their buildings. They were skilled weavers, making cloth of fine quality. The objects they made were not just utilitarian, they were works of art. They were a reflection of their culture, their values, their beliefs. The art of the Vikings was often abstract, a world of interlocking patterns and stylized animal forms. It was a world of complexity and meaning. The patterns were not just decorative, they were symbolic. They represented the forces of nature, the cycles of life, the power of the gods. The art was a visual language, a way of expressing the ideas and beliefs of the culture. And as the winter wore on, the art and the stories would blend together. The carvings on the tools, the patterns on the cloth, the designs on the jewelry. These were the visual counterparts to the stories that were told around the fire. The longhouse was filled with these objects, a testament to the creative power of the people. The sense of community was the most powerful force of all. The people were bound together by ties of blood, marriage, and friendship. They were bound together by the shared experience of survival. They were bound together by their faith in the gods. The community was more important than the individual. The group was more important than the person. This was not a society that valued individualism. It was a society that valued the collective. And the collective, the community, was the key to their survival. The longhouse was the symbol of this community. It was the place where they gathered, the place where they worked, the place where they lived. It was the physical embodiment of their values. The longhouse was the center of their world. The Vikings were not just a people, they were a culture. They had their own customs, their own traditions, their own way of life. They were a distinct people, set apart from the other peoples of Europe. They were a people of the sea, a people of the winter, a people of the longhouse. And as the winter began to fade, the people would look forward to the summer. The summer was a time of adventure, a time of exploration. The men would set sail, exploring new lands, trading with new peoples. The women would tend the farms, managing the household, keeping the community together. The children would grow, learning the skills they would need as adults. The cycle of life would continue. But the winter was always there, a memory in the back of their minds. The lessons learned in the winter, the skills developed in the winter, the strength forged in the winter, these were the things that shaped them. The winter was the crucible, the time of testing. The summer was the reward, the time of living. The world of the Vikings was a hard world, a brutal world, but it was also a beautiful world, a world of mystery and magic. The people who lived in this world were tough, resilient, and brave. They were a people of great courage and great passion. They were the Vikings. As the spring began to break, the snow would melt, the ice would crack, the rivers would flow, the world would come back to life. The people would come out of their longhouses, blinking in the sunlight. They would stretch their limbs, breathe the fresh air, and look up at the blue sky. The winter was over. They had survived, and they would be ready for whatever the new year would bring. The first ships would be launched. The trade routes would open. The raids would begin. The Viking world was waking up. The longhouse, which had been their refuge, would become a quieter place. The people would be on the move, exploring the world, making their mark. The longhouse was the base, the foundation from which they operated, but the world was their playground. The spring was a time of optimism. The people were full of energy, full of hope. The sun was shining, the days were growing longer, the future was bright. They would set out on their journeys, their hearts full of ambition. They would return in the autumn, their ships laden with treasure, and they would retreat to the longhouse to tell the stories of their adventures, to share the wealth they had gained. And the stories would be told. The stories of the battles, the stories of the new lands, the stories of the strange peoples they had encountered. The longhouse would be filled with the excitement of these tales. The children would listen, their eyes wide with wonder. The old men would nod, remembering the days of their own youth. The community would be united in the shared experience of these stories. The Viking world was a world of paradox. It was a world of great violence and great beauty, a world of fierce independence and deep community, a world of brutal winters and bright summers. It was a world of constant change and eternal cycles. It was a world that was both simple and complex. And the longhouse was the center of this world. It was the place where the contradictions were resolved, the place where the violence and the beauty, the independence and the community, the winter and the summer, all came together. The longhouse was the heart of the Viking world. The people who lived in these longhouses were not just survivors, they were creators. They created a culture, a civilization, a way of life. They created stories, poems, laws, and art. They created ships that could cross the ocean. They created a society that was both ordered and free. They created a legacy that has lasted for 1,000 years. And we, listening to this story, are the inheritors of that legacy. We are the descendants of the people who lived in the longhouses. We carry their blood in our veins, their stories in our hearts. The winter, the hardship, the resilience, these are part of our history. They are part of who we are. As the light of the fire flickers and the shadows dance on the walls, we can imagine the people of the longhouse. We can imagine their lives, their struggles, their joys. We can imagine their world, a world so different from our own, and we can learn from them. We can learn about resilience, about community, about the importance of living in harmony with the world. The Vikings, the people of the longhouse, have much to teach us. The cycle continued. The summer passed, the autumn arrived, and the winter returned. The people of the longhouse faced the darkness again, as they had always done, but they were not afraid. They had faced the darkness before and they had survived. They had the stories, the songs, the community. They had the longhouse, and they had each other. The winter nights were long, but they were not empty. They were filled with the sound of the loom, the clang of the hammer, the murmur of the stories. They were filled with the warmth of the fire, the comfort of the furs, the presence of the family. The longhouse was not just a building. It was a living thing, a repository of memory and hope. And as the years passed, the generations came and went. The children grew up, they had children of their own, and they passed on the stories. The longhouse was rebuilt, repaired, and renewed. The culture continued, adapting and evolving, but always retaining the core of its traditions. The Vikings, the people of the longhouse, were not a static people. They were a dynamic people, always changing, always growing. The raids, the trade, the exploration, these were the engines of their change. They were exposed to new ideas, new cultures, new ways of life. They absorbed these influences, incorporating them into their own culture. The Viking world was not an isolated world. It was a world in contact with the rest of Europe, with the Middle East, with the Americas. And this contact enriched their culture, broadened their horizons. The longhouse remained the center of their world, but the world itself was growing larger. The Vikings were becoming more sophisticated, more cosmopolitan. They were leaving their mark on the world, and the world was leaving its mark on them. And then the Viking age began to fade. The raids stopped, the trade routes shifted, the culture changed. The people of the longhouse were assimilated into the broader European culture. The old gods were replaced by the new god. The old ways were forgotten. The longhouse became a relic of the past. But the memory of the longhouse, the memory of the people who lived in it, did not fade. The stories, the poems, the sagas, these were preserved. They were written down, copied, and read. They were passed down from generation to generation. The legacy of the Vikings lived on. And we, sitting here in our own comfortable homes, are the custodians of that legacy. We are the ones who remember the longhouse. We are the ones who tell the stories. We are the ones who keep the memory alive. The Vikings, the people of the longhouse, are not gone. They live on in our imagination, in our culture, in our history. The fire in the longhouse has gone out. The people have left. The building has crumbled to dust. But the stories remain. They are the light in the darkness, the warmth in the cold. They are the legacy of the longhouse. And as we listen to these stories, we are transported back in time. We are sitting by the fire, listening to the skald. We are part of the community. We are part of the longhouse. The night is quiet. The stars are out. The world is sleeping. But in our imagination, the longhouse is alive. The fire is burning, the people are gathered, the stories are being told, the cycle continues. The darkness is kept at bay, and we are there witnessing it all. And we are there witnessing it all. We are the silent observers, the visitors from another time standing at the threshold of the longhouse looking in. We can see the faces of the people lit by the firelight. We can hear their voices rising and falling in the rhythm of the story. We can feel the warmth of the fire, the heat on our skin. We can smell the smoke, the food, the animals. We are there in the longhouse, sharing the experience of the Viking winter. But as the story continues, the fire begins to dim. The voices grow softer. The faces become less distinct. The longhouse starts to fade. The world of the Vikings, so vivid and so real, is receding. The modern world is returning. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the glow of the screen, these are the sounds and sights of our own time. We are being pulled back gently from the past. And yet we take something with us, a memory, a feeling, and understanding. The people of the longhouse, with their resilience and their courage, have left their mark on us. We have learned from them. We have been inspired by them. We have shared their journey, their struggle, their survival. We have walked the frozen paths. We have sat by the smoky fire. We have listened to the stories of the gods. The winter night stretches on outside our window. The world is still, the air is cold. The stars are out, scattered across the sky like a handful of diamonds. The moon is a pale sliver, casting a thin, silver light on the sleeping earth. It is a beautiful night, a peaceful night. The kind of night that invites reflection, that encourages stillness. And in the stillness, we can still hear the echo of the longhouse. The crackle of the fire, the murmur of the voices, the sound of the old man's voice telling the story. It is a faint echo, a whisper from the past. But it is there, a reminder of the enduring power of story, the enduring power of memory. The Vikings, the people of the longhouse, have faded into the mists of time. But their stories, their songs, their legacy, these remain. They are woven into the fabric of our own culture. They have shaped our language, our literature, our understanding of the world. We are the heirs of the Vikings, whether we know it or not. And as we sit here in the quiet of the night, we can honor that inheritance. We can remember the people of the longhouse, the people who faced the darkness and did not flinch. We can remember their courage, their resilience, their hope. We can learn from their example. We can face our own darkness with the same strength, the same determination. The night is long, but it will pass. The dawn will come as it always does. The sun will rise, chasing away the shadows. The cycle will continue. The world will turn. And we will be there, ready for whatever the new day brings. We will be stronger for the journey we have taken. We will be wiser for the stories we have heard. The longhouse is gone, but the spirit of the longhouse lives on. It lives on in the stories we tell, in the songs we sing, in the traditions we uphold. It lives on in the values we cherish, the values of community, courage, and resilience. It lives on in the way we face our own winters, our own darkness. The Vikings were a people of the winter. They were shaped by the cold, the darkness, the hardship. But they were also a people of the spring, a people of hope. They knew that the winter would end, that the sun would return. They carried this hope in their hearts, even in the darkest moments. And we too can carry this hope. No matter how long the winter, no matter how dark the night, the spring will come. The sun will return. The world will be reborn. This is the lesson of the longhouse. This is the gift of the Vikings. As the night deepens, the world grows quieter. The sounds of the day have faded. The hustle and bustle of life has subsided. The only sound is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. The only light is the soft glow of the screen. The past and the present have merged, creating a moment of timelessness, a moment of peace. And in this moment we can let go. We can release the worries of the day, the anxieties of the future. We can allow ourselves to be carried by the story, by the rhythm of the words, by the calm voice of the narrator. We can surrender to the quiet, to the stillness, to the peace. The journey is almost over. The longhouse is fading, the people are disappearing. The fire is dying, its embers glowing red. The last story has been told. The night is at its deepest. The world is at rest. But the memory of the journey remains. The memory of the longhouse, the memory of the winter, the memory of the people. It will stay with us, a quiet companion in the dark. It will remind us of the strength within us, the resilience within us. It will comfort us, soothe us, guide us. The Vikings in their longhouses faced the darkness and found the light. They faced the cold and found the warmth. They faced the silence and found the story. They faced their fears and found their courage. And we, in our own way, can do the same. The screen is growing dim. The words are slowing down. The voice is becoming softer, more distant. The story is ending. The longhouse is closing its doors. The fire is going out. The people are sleeping. And we too are sleeping. Our eyes are growing heavy, our bodies are relaxing. The tension is draining away. The peace is descending, soft and gentle, like the first snow of winter. There is no rush. There is no urgency. There is only the quiet, the stillness, the night. The world is calm. The stars are watching. The moon is sailing through the sky. The dream is approaching. And in the dream, we will return to the longhouse. We will sit by the fire. We will listen to the stories. We will be part of the community. We will be part of the Viking world. We will be there in the warmth and the light, safe and secure. The journey has been long, but it has been worth it. We have traveled to a distant land, a distant time. We have seen the world through the eyes of others. We have understood their struggles, their joys, their hopes. We have shared their story. And now it is time to rest. It is time to let the story settle. It is time to let the images fade. It is time to let the peace take over. The night is deep. The sleep is calling. The darkness is not something to fear. It is something to embrace. It is a refuge, a place of rest, a source of renewal. The longhouse is a memory. The Vikings are a memory. But the lessons they taught us are not a memory. They are a living presence. They are part of who we are. They are part of our own story. And as we drift towards sleep, we can carry those lessons with us. We can carry the courage, the resilience, the hope. We can carry the community, the connection, the love. We can carry the memory of the longhouse. The night is peaceful. The world is quiet. The stars are bright. The moon is shining. The snow is falling, a soft, gentle blanket of white. The winter is beautiful. The winter is calm. The winter is a time for rest. And we are resting. We are letting go. We are surrendering to the night. The story has ended. The journey is complete. The peace has arrived. The fire is out. The embers have cooled. The longhouse is empty. The people have gone. The winter continues. The world is still. But we are not alone. We have the memory. We have the story. We have the peace. And we have the night. The night which cradles us, soothes us, and carries us into the dream. If you're still awake, I hope you're feeling a little more peaceful than when we began. I hope the weight of the day has lifted, even just a little. I hope the stories have taken you somewhere far away, somewhere quiet and still. The longhouse is there in the distance, a faint glow on the horizon. The Vikings are there, a whisper on the wind. The winter is there, a soft, silent presence. The night is there all around us. And we are here together in this quiet space, sharing this moment, this breath, this calm. Take your time, relax, and let sleep arrive whenever it chooses. There is no need to force it. There is no need to struggle. Just let the peace wash over you like the gentle waves of the sea. Let the stillness fill you like the silent snow. Let the night embrace you like the warmth of the longhouse. This has been a journey through time, a journey into the heart of the Viking winter, a journey into the soul of a people, a journey into the quiet, resilient spirit that lives on in all of us. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me. Thank you for sharing these moments, these stories, this peace. Your presence here in this space has made the journey richer, deeper, more meaningful. If you enjoyed this journey, if the stories have touched you, I would be honored if you would like this video. It's a small gesture, but it tells me that you were here, that you listened, that the Longhouse opened its doors to you. And I would be truly grateful if you would subscribe so we can travel together again. So we can share another night, another story, another journey into the quiet places of the past. And if you feel moved, if there is a story you want to share, a thought you want to express, a whisper you want to send into the dark, please leave a comment. I read them. They are the voices that keep the fire burning. They are the stories that keep the Longhouse alive. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is, what you're feeling. Your voice is a part of this community, this circle around the fire. But for now, there is no more to say. The story is told. The journey is over. The night is here, and the peace is ours. The snow is falling. The embers are glowing. The stars are fading. The dawn is approaching, a faint light on the horizon. The cycle is turning. The winter is ending. The spring is coming. And we, the travelers, the listeners, the dreamers, we are returning. Returning to our own lives, our own homes, our own quiet moments. But we are not the same. We have been touched by the story. We have been changed by the journey. We carry the memory of the Longhouse in our hearts. The fire is dying. The voice is fading. The screen is going dark. The night is complete. The peace is total. The sleep is deep. Until our next story, this is Thomas, wishing you a peaceful night. Good night.